Hello and welcome everyone to today's Norms and Behavioral Change Talk, which is hosted by the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics here at the University of Pennsylvania. My name is Alex Spainoff. I'm a senior data research scientist here at the center. And I'll take you through today's session so I'll give a brief introduction of the center. I'll talk about some of our plans, and then I'll hand it over to today's two speakers. In our session today, we'll start with a talk by an early career researcher, Paul Landway, and then we'll follow with the main talk by Michael Hallsworth. After these talks, we'll have a Q&A segment open to all participants towards the end of today's session, which you are able to participate by either raising your hand or asking questions in the chat box, and I'll try to monitor them and moderate the talk. So if you have any questions, at the end of the talk, feel free to use the raise your hand gesture or post the question in the chat box. For anyone who might be new to the series, the NoBeC talks are organized by the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics here at Penn, with the support of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, and in partnership with the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program. The center itself is a research center which provides specialized consulting, research, and training services to organizations throughout the world seeking to enact positive behavioral change. In addition to today's talk, we actually have a series of wonderful speakers. We have Alessandro Santoso, Folco Panizza, Lisa Spantich, and Greg Sparkman planned for the rest of the year. And then as our schedule fills up, we'll update you with what's going to be happening in the following semester. Recordings of NoBeC talks are available on our YouTube channel, so you're always able to review the talks that you're interested in. Lastly, before we go to today's talks, I just want to give a few reminders. You should be automatically muted. If not, please kindly mute yourself. It'll greatly facilitate the process. If possible, please keep your camera on so we have a more interactive experience. And as I said already, for questions, please use the chat at any time or raise hand at the end. And here's the link for the recordings that you can review. You can see today's recording, but also all of the previous talks that we had. And with that, we're going to proceed to the main part of today's meeting. So we have first of all, we have an early career researcher today, Paul Landway. Paul is a postdoctoral scholar at Stanford University, researching the social psychology of polarization in American politics. He received a PhD in political science with departmental distinction from Yale University in May 2025. And his research has been published in American Politics Research, Environmental Politics, and the Yale Journal of International Affairs. And he'll give us a talk today on social dominance orientation, on the fact that social dominance orientation, not affirmative action incentives, shapes interracial economic game behavior. And with that, I'm going to pass the word to Paul. So Paul, if you can share the screen and give us your brief talk, we'd greatly appreciate it.
Okay. As mentioned, I'm Paul Landway, and I'm a postdoctoral scholar at Stanford University. And today's talk is Social Dominance Orientation, Not Affirmative Action Incentives, Shapes Interracial Economic Game Behavior. And so as a brief outline, I'm going to motivate why we might want to study white interracial economic game behavior before going into the primary research questions and hypotheses. I'll then go into the central research design consisting of 3 surveys before going into the results and concluding. And so as a general motivation, prior research has found that resource distribution in multiracial societies is often shaped by the ethno-racial makeup in them, which is a fancy way of saying that work by Alcina et al. And others have found that basically in more diverse municipalities, there tends to be lower levels of redistribution. And that's their explanation for why historically and currently the US has a smaller welfare state relative to that of Europe. And there's additional research probing exactly to what extent racial identity matters for interracial cooperation. So Label et al. Have research basically that on one hand shows that there's the race of a needy experimenter does not influence sharing behavior. And on the other hand, research by Renaud and Schutz shows that children as young as 3 years old are basically tend to give more resources to an unfamiliar white rather than an unfamiliar black partner. So there's mixed research in the experimental psychology literature on this, but mixed with the empirical finding from the Alcina et al. Work, it leads us to want to probe to what extent might the policy environment shape interracial cooperation, and to what extent might pre-existing psychological predispositions shape interracial cooperation. And so we had several core hypotheses for this work. One, the in-group bias hypothesis, that in economic games, players will be more pro-social towards those players who share a racial identity compared to those who do not. And then we have a kind of a competing hypothesis, a status bias hypothesis, that participants from a higher social status group, and we have in mind here the white respondents, will be more pro-social towards participants from a traditionally disenfranchised one. We also theorize that subjects with higher levels of pre-existing levels of social dominance orientation, a view of a more hierarchical society, will be less pro-social and more resentful towards minorities. And then we also have an affirmative action hypothesis that material benefits, and particularly affirmative action policies targeting non-whites, will reduce white pro-sociality towards non-whites. And so in terms of research design, as I mentioned, we test this through 3 surveys. And so in every survey, subjects consent, affirm to be at least 18, answer basic demographic questions, and then they're told that they have a partner of an unspecified race, or white, black, or Latino. So one of those 4 categories, and you notice that's in every game. And for every game, they have the partner of the same, either anonymous, white, black, or Latino identification. But then notice that across the different surveys, we change the level of affirmative action policy. So in particular, in the study 1, we don't have an affirmative action policy introduced. However, in study 2, non-white partners are given a 50-cent affirmative action bonus. And then in study 3, non-white partners are given either a $5 bonus or a $2,000 bonus. So in the white subjects that are our main subject pool, see that not only whether their partner is of an unspecified race, white, black, or Latino, but also the extent of this affirmative action policy, if there is one. With that information, they then play 5 economic games, which I'll get into a second, before we ask about partner attitudes. So our main outcomes then are partner attitudes and white interracial or white game behavior, which may or may not have an interracial component. And then in terms of the 5 games, we have the dictator game, joy of destruction game, ultimatum, prisoner's dilemma, and trust, right? So these are very common games from the experimental economics literature. Briefly, in the dictator game, the white sender subject is given 50 cents and told they can decide how much of it to split with their partner, so measuring altruism. In the joy of destruction game, the white sender subject is told their partner has 50 cents and that the white sender can decide how much of that to destroy, or so, in other words, that the partner would not get, and so a measurement of resentment. In the ultimatum game, the white sender subject proposes to the partner an amount of the 50 cents to split, and the receiving partner decides whether or not to accept. If they reject it, both partners get nothing. If they accept it, that split, the proposed split, occurs. So clearly measuring fairness. And the prisoner's dilemma, both subjects have the sender and the receiver have the option to go up or down. If they both go up, they both get 40 cents. If one goes up and the other goes down, one gets 50 cents and the one that goes up and the one that goes down gets 0. And then if they both go down, they both get 10 cents. And so this measures cooperation, of course, because we know in the prisoner's dilemma game that the Pareto optimal outcome of cooperation, both going up, is not the Nash equilibrium, right? The mutual best response is mutual defection. And then the trust game, where a subject is given 50 cents, decides the white subject decides how much to send to the partner. The partner then gets that amount tripled and decides how much to give to the white sender. So again, called the trust game because it's a measurement of trust. And this just briefly goes into the sample size for each study for the white, black, white Latino, white anonymous conditions. Okay, so you see it's pretty similar. So big picture, white subjects are told which of those 4 groups they're in. They're also told the extent to which there's affirmative action policy, which is nothing for the first study, 50 cents for the second, and then $5 or 2,000 for the third study. And then what we're interested in is how our measurement of pre-existing SEO or the extent of these affirmative action policies might moderate white game behavior. And then after this, the games, they are asked questions about attitudes, so moderate partner attitudes. And this is just a quick example. Of course, we do not name the economic games that they're presented with to the white subjects, but for example, for the ultimatum game, you see offer game, we explain the setup with the 50 cents that they propose to their partner, and we make it very clear. In this case, it's a white partner. And so to briefly go over the results, for attitudes, subject, this is again following the economic games, white subjects were asked the extent to which they see their partner as deserving, generous, likable, nice, trustworthy, and then we have a pooled measure. And what you see is that in the white-black condition and white-Latino condition, that white subjects have, when pooling together attitudes towards their partner, that they have a statistically significant warmer affect towards their partner, okay, relative to just the white-white condition. So this actually supports hypothesis 1B, that the white social group seems to be actually have predisposed towards more pro-social affect towards the Black or Latino partner in those games. And then separately, we're looking at game behavior here. You see each of the 5 economic games in addition to the pooled index, and it cleanly maps to the attitudes. We see that in the white-black conditions and white-Latino conditions, white subjects are being more pro-social towards their partner relative to white-white or white anonymous. Okay, so again, this generally reflects the hypothesis 1B. Now we want to see how much does social dominance orientation matter? How much does affirmative action policies matter? And so what you see here, we regressed pro-social game behavior with each column here is a unique game in addition to the pooled average. So we regress that on the group that the white subject was assigned to. So white, black, white Latino, white anonymous is our control. And then we interacted that with the extent of the affirmative action policy, 0, 50 cents, $5, or $2,000. And so what's really interesting and surprised us that does not support the affirmative action policy hypothesis is that the extent of the affirmative action policy does not seem to have an interaction with the group that the racial identification of the partner that the white subject is matched with. Okay, so you see clearly here there's no statistically significant interaction between the extent of the affirmative action policy and the racial identification of the partner. However, when we interact pre-existing levels of social dominance orientation with the group that the white subject was partnered with, we see a statistically significant main effect and negative interaction, particularly for white Latino and white Black. Okay, so putting this all together, what we're finding is at a baseline, so I showed the study 1 results for partner attitudes and game behavior. At a baseline, white subjects have more pro-social aspect towards the Latino or Black partners and are more pro-social towards them. However, when we pool the results across all 3 studies and look at the varying levels of affirmative action policies, what we're finding is that the extent of the affirmative action policy is not affecting pro-social game behavior. However, pre-existing levels of social dominance orientation are moderating that behavior. So thank you again for letting me present some of my latest research, and I'm really excited for Michael's talk and to hear feedback on this during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Paul. And there was just a quick question about slide 12. When you presented the 6 graphs, it looks like they were all on different scales. And I think there was just a question from the audience on what was the scale. And then did that affect the different regressions that you ran when you run different games? Are they actually on different scales? How do you pull them together then?
I see. If I remember correctly, I think when we did the pooled index, we made sure that each of the games was rescaled to be on the same scale. And I think in the case of, I think one of them, I think it was the Joy of Destruction, I think we had to reverse scale. But basically, we had it so that for the pooled index, they had a parallel scale. And I think, as was correctly identified, that when separated, they were
And
distinct.
it's just the payoff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then another comment in the chat, the fact that you're explicitly saying white partner is odd and could easily create perverse effects. Subjects immediately realize the game is about race. So did you think about that, and did you
Mhm.
think about how to address that?
Yeah, and of course we wanted to make it salient, and there the main response is, well, we had that also equally salient, right, with a Black partner or a Latino partner, and we found these effects relative to the baseline that I mentioned with SVO for the Black partner, Latino partner, but not for the white partner. And so basically, I think the gist of it is that that priming was true for all of the treatment groups of the racial identification of the partner. Great questions.
Thank you so much. And just in the interest of time, if you can post your contact info in the chat box, if anyone has any additional questions, they'll be able to contact you, and this way we can continue the communication after this talk.
Perfect. Absolutely. I'll do that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And on that note, I'm uh, proceeding to our main talk today by Dr. Michael Hallsworth. Michael is Chief Behavioral Scientist at the Behavioral Insights team and also a distinguished lecturer here at the University of Pennsylvania. He has been a leading figure in developing the field of applying behavioral science to real-world issues. For 20 years, he has worked both as an advisor to various governments and an official. He is a co-author of the book Behavioral Insights from MIT Press, and his work has been published, among others, in The Lancet, the Journal of Public Economics, Nature Human Behavior, etc. And his new book is The Hypocrisy Trap, and it's out October 2025. Uh, he has a PhD in behavioral economics from Imperial College London. He's currently with us teaching for the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences, and previously held positions at Columbia University and Princeton University. And Michael, without further ado, I'll pass the word to you.
Thanks so much, Alex, and thanks for using a photo of me from about 8 years ago. It's very flattering. I want to talk to you all about the concept of hypocrisy, and I'm just trying to share my screen a second. Yeah, so one thing I should just say about this is that I think this is a fairly academic audience. This presentation is somewhere in between an academic presentation and a general presentation because this book and this research I've been doing is attempting to be one of those kind of synthesis books that, I read all the literature in the field, but at the same time tried to sort of present it in an accessible way because I think this concept is incredibly relevant for society. So you may find it slightly different from some of the other talks in this field. It tries to range quite widely across a whole variety of disciplines. So it does psychology, philosophy, political philosophy, and so on, rather than being narrowly looking at a particular mode of research. But I hope also that'll be an interesting change for you. I want to start by sort of just asking the question of how do you define hypocrisy? Now, we don't have time for me to sort of go through and have a discussion here, but if you just pause for a second and think, if you actually had to work out what that means, I encourage you to reflect because it is a word, it's a concept that certainly in Western societies and particularly in Western democracies is used a lot. It's used a lot in the media, it's used a lot particularly in politics, but actually can be quite a slippery concept when you come to think about it. And as I'll explain, it was only about 10 to 15 years ago anyone did any empirical research into what hypocrisy actually is. And when they did that, they found that as far as what people think it is, it's quite different from what philosophers have been saying. So this is a concept I want to be kind of exploring. And I start the book with an anecdote about how integral this concept is to our moral intuitions. But I should say not just moral intuitions, because one thing I try and do in this book is explain that hypocrisy isn't just about morality, it's about claims to status of various kinds. But in this case, the situation was just after Christmas in 2021. My daughter, who was then 7, said, you know, we were saying we've had too many sweet things. She couldn't have any more dessert. She went off to a different room to watch some TV, came back and found me eating some of the cake from the fridge just 5 minutes later. Obviously breaking my own rules. And she said immediately to me, you're like the Prime Minister who was having a party when he said no one else could have parties. And this was a reference to the kind of big scandal at the time in 2021, where the Prime Minister of the UK, who was then Boris Johnson, had promoted a series of lockdown measures for the country, saying you couldn't have more than a certain number of people gather in one space. But the scandal called Partygate was that actually there had been several parties at number 10 Downing Street and with the ruling Conservative Party in violation of these rules. This is a massive kind of scandal and actually led to the downfall of the Prime Minister. It was interpreted as hypocrisy being the main driver of this outrage. And people thought of all the things they couldn't do and made the sacrifices they had made. And then the people telling them to do these things were not following the rules themselves. So you'll see things like it was the hypocrisy that did for Boris Johnson, that actually people were quite attracted to him because he maybe played fast and loose with the truth sometimes. But when he tried to then enforce a rule on others that he then broke, that contradiction or that inconsistency was a real problem. And I'm not just talking about isolated incidents. There is concern that if this this kind of trust that was broken through the apparent hypocrisy has longer term consequences. That was certainly what the formal inquiries into this found. And just yesterday, I was looking at news stories. There was one that came out which was about concern over global warming. What are people thinking right now? Support for measures to combat global warming slipping in the UK. And this caught my attention. One of the participants saying, it's not a top priority, global warming. What annoys me is a bit like COVID, where the government said, this is what you've got to do, and they did their own thing. Even with climate change, they're happy to go on their private jets and get what they need to. It's a little bit hypocritical. So you can see it years later, hangover of this idea. But if you think about this for a second, I completely understand where Thomas is coming from at an emotional level, and I get the anger, but what is the reason that the hypocrisy means that we shouldn't do stuff related to climate change? Logically, there isn't really, like, there's a skipping of the argument here. And so the anger at hypocrisy becomes a reason to do nothing, even though, well, it could be that, say government ministers do need to go on a private jet to get somewhere to a climate conference. That seems hypocritical, but does that undermine the whole concept of doing things for the environment? And that's, in some sense, one of the real paradoxes around hypocrisy, that it can stop you doing things that are in themselves maybe the right thing to do because there's an accusation of hypocrisy. The things in themselves remain the right thing to do. But it kind of short circuits that reasoning and just goes, we hate hypocrisy, that was hypocrisy, therefore that whole area, that's a reason to do nothing. It's a reason to discount any attempt to do the right thing or to go for a particular goal. And so this leads into the question of how we feel about hypocrisy. And it'll be no surprise to many of you to say that it's had a bad reception for hundreds of years. And there are some quotes here about various people from different domains, life, talking about how hypocrisy is a really bad thing. But why is that? Why do we why do we dislike it so much? And I think and in what ways? And there's a new sort of set of research, new agenda that has come up over the last 10 years that tries to explain some of the nuances around hypocrisy. So some findings are, for example, we dislike hypocrisy even more than lying. If I say, if I download music illegally after condemning others for doing that thing, you'll see me worse than if I'd simply lied and said I never download illegally. So, it's this feeling of an additional false claim that it's a bad thing to do, which, as I'll explain later, actually gives the impression that you would never do that thing, that really enrages us. So you can it's not the act of doing the bad thing that is at stake here. It is the way we present it to others. And hypocrisy is seen as a greater claim to status than just saying you never do something. This is a very pervasive problem. So in this particular experiment, people were shown job candidates, and they experimentally varied whether the candidate had a citation for reckless driving. So the variation was, did the citation for reckless driving contradict this person's work previously for a campaign against reckless driving? Either the person worked on a campaign against reckless driving, or they'd done one against underage drinking. And so if there was a contradiction between the volunteering and then your subsequent behavior, people really did not like that. People saw the candidate as less moral, less competent, offered them a lower starting salary. The offence itself was not the issue at stake here. It was the fact that the candidate had somehow expressed a position on it by volunteering for a cause that they then kind of went against themselves. It's not just individuals, also corporate actors. A whole chapter in the book is about corporate hypocrisy and how we dislike it and how it can be kind of mitigated in some ways. So, if people are asked to judge damages for a company that's been found to pollute a lake with toxic waste, they actually recommend more damages, more jail time for executives if that company had made commitments about the environment. Right, so the bad action is the same, the pollution. It's just the claims before are varied, and that leads to a substantive difference in punishment. One reason for the punishment is there's something satisfying or indeed enjoyable about the act of hypocrites getting their comeuppance. So the various people have reflected that it can be almost like the structure of a joke. There's a punchline in terms of someone setting up their claim to a reputation, and then that's undermined by the revelation that they have not been doing that thing. And people have done some work on Schadenfreude, related concept, this kind of pleasure you get through people's misfortune. And the graph on the left shows, if you experimentally vary again, whether someone has been, say, advocating against plagiarizing and then is caught plagiarizing versus advocating against plagiarizing and being caught stealing, the match really matters. So people feel much greater pleasure at the downfall if you have been caught for the exact thing that you have been advocating against. It's almost like I mentioned, a joke, and you can see that in cases where, like on the right-hand side, an article against plagiarism was retracted for plagiarism because it is the exact guilty of the exact thing that you're advocating. So there's some satisfaction we get in this kind of seeking out of hypocrisy. I can talk a bit later about one reason for that satisfaction is because social status is often a zero-sum game. When others gain, we lose in relative terms. Whereas if you can expose someone as a hypocrite, you can damage their social status, and in return, we get a relative boost. So there's a whole set about things about how we have these incentives to take down hypocrites. We enjoy it, and that may explain why we see hypocrisy everywhere. You giving any kind of opinion, even a very tentative one, can put you at the risk of this. I give some findings here from psychological studies that show this. You don't even have to give an opinion verbally to be seen as hypocritical. People can see it in your actions. If you do one thing, then another thing which seems to contradictory. If you seem to appear virtuous in one setting and then do something bad in another, people assign hypocrisy to that as well. And you may think, oh, okay, this is just an incentive to say nothing and keep out of it, and that will keep me safe. That doesn't appear to be the case either. So study looked into when staying out of it backfires in moral and political disagreements. As I'm sure you all know, this is AJ McLean from the Backstreet Boys. They've shown a video, participants in the study, where AJ McLean is asked what he and the band think about politics. And he says, "We are neutral. I'm not taking either side. It's just uncomfortable." If people are told that they were approached by a right-wing TV station, they think that AJ McLean's real political views are on the left and he's trying to conceal them. And the reverse is true if it's a left-wing TV station. They assume that his views are on the right. So the attempt to stay out of it is often seen as an attempt to actually conceal your real views and avoid conflict by giving the appearance of neutrality. It's seen as hypocritical. And yet, despite all this, despite everything I just said about how much we dislike hypocrisy, there are actually some kinds of hypocrisy that we tolerate or indeed even like. And in the book, I give various examples of these situations. There can be cases where we actually think that someone is concealing their good deeds. In the study from 2020, participants are given the example of someone called Noel Biderman, who set up the Ashley Madison website, which has enables people, or did enable people, to have extramarital affairs. And they gave a situation where it actually turns out that this man is faithful in his private life despite publicly advocating for infidelity. People see that as hypocritical, but they also see it as morally better. Now, you may think that we don't go around concealing our virtues and vices. We don't go around concealing our virtues and emphasizing our vices. But it's worth remembering that quite often there are different kinds of social status, and you may have a reputation for being a free-thinking maverick, and that gets you money. Think of various corporate actors who present themselves as rule breakers. There is a kind of status that can come through that as well. But you actually may be, behind the scenes, actually quite virtuous. There are instances where it actually helps to be a hypocrite because it makes you more relatable if you're seen to have flaws. There is some evidence in this first study that people who are overweight are less likely to go and see doctors who are very fitness conscious and advocate for physical activity because they worry about being devalued. And so they'd actually rather go and see doctors who are less healthy and closer in weight to themselves. On the right-hand side, you can see evidence from a study around do-gooder derogation, where if you think that the people trying to convince you are just too virtuous, for example, in climate settings, you're actually less convinced by them. You can't relate to them. So that's what you see in the view that, in the condition in the middle here, where actually people who are somewhat sustainable in their lifestyles are actually slightly more convincing to people than those who are like highly sustainable. You actually in politics may get punished less if you give a strong moral position, which you then violate, than if you give a slightly nuanced position, which you will remain true to. So if you say something like lying's never okay, but then you're found to be lying, yes, you get a big penalty from being a hypocrite, but actually you end up slightly better off than a politician who says it's sometimes okay to lie and then is found to be lying. You know, that's less hypocritical in some ways because you open the possibility that you think it's okay sometimes. But your reputational hit from making that initial nuanced statement is so big that you actually end up worse off in your judgment. So people would rather have a clear moral position or a clear statement or a clear social status claim that is then violated than a kind of slightly disreputable one or one that's more nuanced. And then finally, we may be just in a position of having multiple competing values and demands. And sometimes we think, yeah, we have to make compromises. We have to try to be inconsistent or not be fully in line with our principles. This is the domain of white lies, if you like, of saving someone's feelings in order to produce a greater good is the idea. And you know, if you're running a company, for example, you have multiple demands and your multiple priorities, multiple people to satisfy. It may be impossible to be entirely consistent, and we kind of understand that. So the reason why I want to talk about all this is there's evidence that the concept of hypocrisy is confusing. It is both very integral to our kind of judgments of others, but there's a complicated situation where we seem to hate it. We seem to find it okay sometimes, and it seems to operate in ways we don't fully understand. And that's what I try to get at in the book, which is coming out next month. And one thing I try to do is explain what is hypocrisy. And this is helped by the fact that, as I mentioned, the last 10 years I've seen a lot of research into this topic that has increased from the psychological perspective. So to start with, originally the idea of hypocrisy was from the theatre, Greek theatre, where you were playing a part. And that's fine in one sense because people are in the theatre and they know you are playing a part. The danger comes, or the concern comes, when it moves out of a theatrical setting where you're not sure if someone is playing a part or not. And it, over the course of about 1,000 years, it in particular adopted religious connotations through Christianity. Jesus was very famously against hypocrisy. If you look at the definitions of hypocrisy in dictionaries, you get deceit and pretense as the strongest common themes, and immorality and inconsistency are following behind that. However, it was only in 2013 that anyone bothered to ask people what they actually thought hypocrisy was. And that study points out that folk wisdom is kind of the ultimate arbiter of what hypocrisy entails, because it is a judgment that we make of others. And if you actually ask people, you get different results from the dictionary definitions. What comes out very strongly is the theme of inconsistency, imposing standards on others, and creating a public signal about your behavior. And so I'm going to explain some of this. What I try and do in the book is bring all this together, this new research, and give a new synthesis of what actually hypocrisy is. And I say it consists of 3 parts. The base level is inconsistency of some kind. So that can be of various kinds. It can be a gap between someone's attitudes and their behaviors. It can be between one attitude they express and another attitude they express. Or it can be even between one behavior and another behavior. And I'm actually going to talk about that particular aspect, inconsistency, in a bit more detail. I have some empirical data on it. The second aspect is there has to be some kind of benefit. The person's inconsistency has to bring them some kind of benefit. And I explain the 2 main kinds of benefits are a boost to social status, i.e. how they look to others, or a boost to your self-image, how you look to yourself. And then the final component is injustice. So those benefits, we must view these benefits as unjust or unfair in some way. And the most obvious example is if someone gains social status as, say, a good person through sending false signals about what they do consistently in their life, or if they feel better about themselves and their behaviors than they deserve to. I'll explain a bit later that it's very important to see this as a judgment. I'm not saying that hypocrisy is a thing that exists. It is a process of making judgments about others. Okay? I would say the most important of these three parts is inconsistency in terms of the definition of hypocrisy. I think it's hard, if not impossible, to have hypocrisy without inconsistency. Yet it is in the injustice part of it that is most important for how we judge hypocrites. That is the fuel for our anger. And I should point out that I'm drawing on research from various different scholars to put together this synthesis. And I'm grateful for them for doing that work. The book builds that basic insight out into a kind of map of hypocrisy. And this is the middle section of the book, which goes into all the empirical research into these different concepts and how they together form our judgments, or the intensity of our judgments about hypocrisy. And what I kind of point out is that these are like elements which can build up to a very damning judgment of hypocrisy. So if you imagine that you turned all of these dials to the maximum, you'd have a very, very harsh judgment of someone as hypocritical, because they can exist in different levels of intensity and different combinations. And we're kind of quite sensitive to how intense, how big the inconsistency is, for example. How unjust or how much harm is being created by the inconsistency. And to bring out the nuances in the judgments, I'm going to look at some empirical research I did around inconsistency. So the question is, what kinds of inconsistency do we dislike the most? Is it saying one thing and doing another? Or is it, saying one thing in one situation and then a different one in a different situation, being two-faced? So to do this, I created some scenarios, and the idea was to modify the different kinds of inconsistency. The basic scenario was around a friend you had who said that everyone should give money to people who are homeless when you see them in the street, for example. And then later that evening, they go past a homeless person in the street and do not give them money. So there's a statement and a behavior. And this can be varied in different ways. So you can have a statement and then a different statement. And that's what we have in the second part here. You have a statement about you should do this, and then you're speaking to someone else and you say the opposite. And then you can have, finally, in a very basic sense, a behavior-behavior contrast. So you give money, and then you don't give money in another situation. Okay? So to set out the different combinations here, to make these comparisons, I first had a situation where someone was consistent between their statement and their behavior. They say everyone should give money and they do it. And then I have various kinds of inconsistency, which you can see here, and I won't go into much detail. But to highlight, one of them was actually around thought. There were no statements involved. The friend thinks to themselves that everyone should give money to homeless people and then doesn't. Okay? And this is to test the idea that you can see hypocrisy even if someone does not make any kind of social claims to others. And that gets to the idea I mentioned around self-image. So, the idea would be that I go around thinking in a sort of smug, self-satisfied way that I'm a good person, and I fail to recognize that my actions don't live up to that ideal, even though I don't mention it to anyone. This is the basic setup of the experiment. The BitBit was doing some research in the UK, and I took advantage of that to run the side experiment. 6,000 participants, they were asked to view one of these scenarios and then rate hypocrisy, and also about their kind of moral judgment of what the friend did. This is on a 1 to 7 scale for all of them. Here are the results. Again, this is not like I'm not showing you a regression table here because it's not like a fully kind of academic style presentation, but all the necessary information is there. The study is very well powered. I'm going to show you some results. They include, I used the Benjamini-Hochberg correction for multiple comparisons. It didn't make much difference because you can see the p-values here. So the first thing I want to say is that, as you might expect, having a gap between your words and your actions is seen as very hypocritical. But also, not living up to the standards you propose for others is seen as worse than contradicting a claim you've made about your own behavior. So what that means is people see it as worse to say everyone should give money to people and then not doing it than if you say, I always give money and then don't do it. Okay, that's what you can see in that right-hand comparison there. So, we have a very big difference here in terms of people's views, taking into account that the only difference is inconsistency. Everything else is kind of controlled for. Interestingly, when you look at thoughts, it's actually seen as less bad than making judgments about others. So this is where you think that everyone should give money and then you don't do it. But interestingly, it's kind of comparable to saying that I always give money and then not doing it. So there's no significant difference there in people's judgments, right? It's not that there's the feeling of that you're being self-satisfied is like in a different category. We still see hypocrisy even if people do not make any public claims, even if they're just thinking to themselves that they're good people and that's contradicted by their behavior. We also see statement inconsistency is even more hypocritical than statement behavior inconsistency, which is surprising. So this is where you say one thing to one person and then nothing to another person. We see that as very hypocritical, even more so than contradicting your statement with your actions. I was quite surprised by that, actually, because if you think about it, the behavior at stake, giving money, is the same, potentially. But it's just about the signals that you're sending that we dislike. And then finally, it may not be surprising to know that we see behavior inconsistency as relatively unhypocritical. There's no difference between behavior inconsistency and complete consistency of words and actions. They're rated about the same. But there's a second round to this experiment, and we can say a bit more, because you may say that it's quite likely that people don't impute meaning to, or it's harder to impute intentions or claims to your behavior. Like, behavior can be quite ambiguous. We don't know necessarily what people intend. So to bring that out, I actually did a second round, which did a few things. In particular, it built on these two conditions, and I changed them, or I said to people, okay, think again about the same situation with one change. Someone is consistent between their statement and their actions, but I then clarify, no one else sees them give the money. They don't feel good about themselves. Like, there's no intention to feel good about yourself. They're acting in line with principles. So I'm, in a sense, really juicing up the idea that you're consistent between your actions and your behaviors because you believe in it. And then the opposite was true for the behavior contradiction. I actually introduced a sense that the people are getting a self-image benefit. They think they're the kind of person who always gives money. That makes them feel good about themselves. Okay? So there then is some way of imputing what's going on with the behavior inconsistency. And what you can see here on the left-hand side is just a repeat of what I already showed you, that there's almost no difference between the ratings for hypocrisy between these two groups and the disapproval when you just show the simple first round conditions. When you clarify things in the second round, ratings of hypocrisy and approval diverge. Okay, so what you've got there is they've become seem more different. Does it make a difference to be aware, self-aware of what you're doing here? This is often a question that comes up about, is it better or worse to be an unknowing hypocrite who just goes through and is unaware that they're contradicting their statements? Or is it better to actually know about it and do it deliberately? So to test this, I modified the scenario where you say they say that they always give money themselves, and then I modified it to say, well, actually, they didn't realize they were doing this. They continue to get this kind of self-image benefit. I actually thought this might make people more judgmental. It seemed to actually cut the ratings of hypocrisy quite dramatically when you modify the scenario, and including in terms of declines in disapproval. And then finally, does direct criticism make a difference? Does it matter if you say to people, the people who don't do this are selfish and uncaring, like making explicit criticism of other people and then don't do it yourself? Answer is yes. It does increase both hypocrisy ratings and disapproval ratings. And this goes along with the literature that says condemning others is interpreted by people as a stronger signal that you would not do that thing yourself, even stronger than directly asserting you would not do that thing. So that's just a slice of like one part of it, of the overall picture of explaining hypocrisy. I just want to come to the end by talking about some other aspects which I think are particularly relevant to social norms and NoBeC's concerns. So these look at kind of injustice. And just to think about injustice for a second, you can have situations where there is inconsistent behavior where someone gets benefits themselves, but we don't see it as very hypocritical because there's little injustice. So you might think of a situation where there's, say, a famous singer who's very well-known, is sort of, followed by fans wherever she goes. And as a result, she sometimes gets to have a private session at a shop, or she has access to certain things because she is a celebrity. Now, if you think about the components of hypocrisy I said there is inconsistency in terms of you're being treated differently from other people, and you are getting benefits. But we wouldn't see this as very hypocritical because there's no kind of injustice. We in some way feel that the singer might have earned or deserved this treatment. Similarly, we don't feel there's an injustice when an ambulance with its sirens on goes through a red light, even though that's inconsistent treatment, because we think there's some reason for that. It's just in some way. And I briefly want to say, what is the root cause of this concern over justice? And it goes, I think, back. I adopt a similar kind of evolutionary psychology explanation for this, which is that we often see hypocrites as status-free riders, and we see that as a very unjust statement, an unjust practice. So this takes the view from the kind of evolutionary psychology point of view that we spend a lot of our history in hunter-gatherer bands, and indeed those still exist in countries today, where these are, generally speaking, highly egalitarian, which require a high degree of cooperation, and free riding is heavily punished. And I think the way of understanding our anger at the injustice of hypocrisy is that we see claims to status that are not justified. Sorry, let me explain. We see that hypocrites are often making claims to status that they are not paying the cost for, the appropriate cost. So they are getting status from appearing to be prestigious in some ways, but they are not actually paying what we consider to be a fair price for that, a fair exchange. So you can see these kind of evolutionary explanations saying that, why hypocrisy makes no sense logically, but makes evolutionary psychological sense because it's like a cheater is proposing a social exchange. And I think this comes back to the idea of the relationship between hypocrisy and morality. So throughout the book, I make the case that hypocrisy is about more than morality, even though it's often seen as a moral judgment, because I think that you can take the view that morality itself is sitting on an older concern about unfair social exchanges, which are prompted, that concern is prompted by the sense of injustice within hypocrisy, where you're getting free riding to get status from others without paying the appropriate costs, in our view. And I think that is an interesting kind of social norm coordination point, which is relevant because what you see then is the pursuit of hypocrisy as a form of moralistic aggression to punish free riding. I want to end by talking about one distinction I think is really important in hypocrisy, which is when we say this word, we often mean two different things, and that is kind of combined and obscure. And I try to make a distinction here between the two types, one of which I call common standards hypocrisy, and the other one is double standards hypocrisy. And so in very basic terms, common standards hypocrisy is the idea that you are trying to seem better than you are, that you're getting these unjust gains despite not being consistent with the signals you're sending. So that might be where a politician seems to benefit from supporting family values while also having an extramarital affair. A different kind is what I call double standards hypocrisy, where someone gets unjust gains by being inconsistent in their perceptions, by seeing their team or themselves as operating on different rules. So that might be where I say, I excuse that politician for his extramarital affair because I support his party, but I condemn his opponent for doing the same thing. And I haven't got time to explain why I'm talking about judgment here in this talk because I want to leave time for questions. But maybe I just end by trying to explain this, that the reason why I'm talking about judgment here and that the definitions of hypocrisy about our perceptions of it is there's a well-known, well, not very well-known, but there's a strong argument that hypocrisy and the criticism of hypocrisy are inextricably linked. This is the argument made by Judith Schlar in the book Ordinary Vices. So when we see we see hypocrisy in our criticisms, we kind of create the category by the criticisms we make. And that means that the effects of hypocrisy are actually driven by how our criticisms are operating. Sometimes you can get the persecution of hypocrisy making a kind of going too far and creating a nightmare in society, or actually the nightmare may come about when accusations of hypocrisy have lost all power to influence people. And what I'm saying here is that you need to look at the way we criticize hypocrisy to make sense of its outcomes. Currently, that is really obscured. And in the book, and I won't talk about this, I try to make this all real by explaining that the criticisms of hypocrisy can lead to very different outcomes, which I call these four worlds of hypocrisy. And you can see they try to illustrate how criticism of hypocrisy can drive bad outcomes if they get out of control. Equally, lack of criticism of hypocrisy can drive bad outcomes if we abandon the concept altogether. So my recommendation in the book is we need to keep in a world where we use the concept, but in a way that isolates the most harmful forms of hypocrisy and lets other ones go to a certain extent, that allows greater toleration of some forms of hypocrisy because they allow society to work well without letting that kind of tendency to get out of control and lead to complacency and harm in turn. So this is a lesson for me in terms of trying to present a book in 45 minutes. It's really tough to do, particularly one that goes across a wide range of areas. And I'm very happy to sort of take questions on these concepts that I've raised here, including the empirical research. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Michael. This was a very interesting talk. We now have a Q&A segment until about 2:15 p.m. So we can, first of all, answer the questions in the chat. And also, if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll ask you to unmute then. So, and there was a question from Arjun. Arjun, do you want to unmute yourself and elaborate on your question a little bit? Arjun, I see you unmuted yourself. We cannot hear you, unfortunately. So, but he was...
Oh, yeah, I can read the... Yeah, is it the question in the chat?
Yeah. So he was talking about the baseline of hypocrisy. So
we perceive intensity of change proportional to the baseline. Yeah, it would be... I can't remember what this is referring to. We perceive intensity of change proportional to... Oh, so is that saying that we think that there's...
So some people just have more hypocrisy. Some people just assume that certain groups of people will be more hypocritical to begin with.
Yeah. I don't think that, as far as I can tell, we calculate in that way and price it in the way you might expect. I think because there are two competing views here. If you take politicians, one would be that we particularly hate it because there are greater claims made by, like, politicians are often forced into making statements that may turn out to be inconsistent later. Or you could see that the cynicism means that we don't care so much because they're all, of course, they're lying. And actually, I think that illustrates quite nicely the twin danger, the trap that I'm talking about. The danger on the one hand is that you go too far in criticizing hypocrisy and you end up in a world in which there is no toleration of any inconsistency. And you end up with a ratcheting effect, which I call the purity regime. Or you get to a cynical world where it's like, well, they're all lying, so why should... And you get a nihilistic world where it doesn't really matter anyway, because of course, like, no one cares about principles really. What, you thought anyone would actually care about stuff? And that actually opens the door to people saying, yeah, principles don't matter, so I can just do what I want.
Okay, that makes sense. And I see Christina has a question. So Christina, and if you can unmute yourself, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. It's really interesting, gave me food for thought. Now, the first example is the disconnect between the statement and an action. So let's say there is a rule violation or evasion, which is different, by someone who demands that others follow the rule and possibly blame others. If I demand, I blame if they don't follow the rule, and there is no clear justification for rule violation. And so while we're angry, because not only there is an inconsistency and a disconnect between the demand and the real action, but also in that case, we think that the person benefits, okay, and probably benefits unjustly, from from this behavior. But I think there's something deeper here. And I think we have a deep dislike for inconsistency. And I'm thinking of the disconnect between different action on the same person that reveal attitudes that we cannot reconcile. Your example of the churchgoer and sex shop client, let's say, okay? And there is the inconsistency typically is blamed when we say we cannot trust this person. Without benefit, without, lack of justice, etc., I think there is a really deep dislike for inconsistency, period. Now, the statement action tells me, hey, wait a moment, you benefit from that, whatever. But the action doesn't tell me anything about benefit or justice or whatever. It's just, I don't trust this person at all. And there is a difference between different types of inconsistencies. And in both cases, we think the person is a hypocrite. But our reaction is very different, I think.
Yes, completely. And I talk in the book a lot about the dislike of inconsistency. And yet there are various explanations from behavioral science about why inconsistency is likely and often inevitable. I think also there's a cultural aspect here. So I talk about how the idea of the deliberate reasoning self has been very sort of integral to Western thought, since the Enlightenment, with backlashes against it, in the Romantic period and so on. And yet, there are also views of the self as, like Irving Goffman, the improvising self, like more like a chameleon than a deceptive actor, which I think challenged that. And so I talk about how actually in many cultures, hypocrisy is not such a strong concept. And there have been cross-cultural studies on this, because they're seen as more kind of like more of a need to be sensitive to the social situation and the demands of that, and your kind of public self has to adapt to different settings. And so given the behavioral science evidence about the difficulty of remaining completely consistent and the fact that various other cultures think differently about this, I think challenging the concept of hypocrisy also points to a way of rethinking the role of consistency in our concept of the self, as how the book ends, actually.
Thank you. Just to conclude, because other people are asking questions. This is a very, very important point. And, I don't know these cultural studies about the relaxation of inconsistency in some sense. In our culture, it's very strong. I think we want consistency. Even, if we can invent justification, we tend not to invent them. Either you give me a justification or, I don't trust you. But thank you very much. I would like to see if you can send me the literature about different cultural use of consistency. It's very important, I think.
Yeah, I'll just put it in the chat, actually. You can find it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm going to alternate between the chat and the raised hand. So, Paul, I see your question. I'll get to you in just a moment. So there were two related comments by Angela Wang and by Nat John about statement versus statement behavioral consistency. And they're wondering if that can be related to just the way morality works, to how people interpret different types of inconsistencies. So the statement behavioral inconsistency can be an example of people having principles but having to maintain them. But say statement inconsistency just shows us there's people have no principles whatsoever, and it's just a different category of just morality. So, and I think the second comment was very similar to that. It was just talking about the moral wriggle room literature. So can you elaborate on that?
I mean, I think that is a reasonable interpretation, but you think about there are counterfactuals where there are many instances where we have to say different things to different people, like, you know, which we think are quite excusable. So yeah, I'll just leave it there because we've got so little time. Like, I think there's a bit of hindsight bias where it's like, of course, that's the most harshly rated, because I wasn't necessarily expecting that. I thought it was more excusable than people found it. Paul, I think you found your hand up for a while. Sorry, I just want to make sure that you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, excellent presentation, really thought-provoking. And I agree with Christina's point about, it's fair to say in American culture tend to disprefer hypocrisy, but it's also interesting to think about how your framework of hypocrisy enters the American moment of populism and polarization. It's easy to think about examples on the left or right of hypocrisy, but it's also easy to point to examples where that doesn't seem to affect vote share. So how do we square the two? What do you make of this populist polarized moment?
Yeah, I think it is. I think you have to be very careful that you don't go around thinking that hypocrisy matters. Like George Orwell thought hypocrisy mattered. He actually thought that it was a way that a country kept itself in shape, weirdly, because you never had this kind of open, people felt they couldn't be openly X, whatever, and he thought that was a moderating influence. And so I think the danger comes where you think that consistently making accusations of hypocrisy for whatever, for every kind of inconsistency will do something, where actually it may exhaust the concept altogether and mean that people stop caring about it. That's the brazen power plays world. And therefore you end up in a much worse place at the end. And so I think it is not that you have to think the next stage. Like if you're putting a lot of emphasis on criticizing hypocrisy as a way of stopping something that you don't like, you may be surprised that it actually ends up with more of that stuff in the end, because you've actually indiscriminately emptied the concept of any meaning, and then people just be like, well, it's just the exercise of power then. So that's my kind of slightly theoretical response. There are many responses I can give there.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And Annette, I saw that you tried to unmute yourself. Was there anything that you wanted to add?
Because you were reading out the comment, it was more of a smaller technical point for the chat. But once we're on it, so maybe a slightly more general version of this is, in order to judge an inconsistency, I first need to recognize and classify an inconsistency. And when you have all of your metrics with your statement, and statement behavior, there is differences in how easy it is to recognize what is and is not inconsistent. So for statements, it might be fairly straightforward to say this statement is not consistent with this one. For behavior, I would already say there's a lot more margin. And you just said you would expect different people to act differently. Exactly. So when you ate the cake, you probably have different rules because it doesnn't prevent you from eating dinner. So there's just more involved. There's just more involved in the classification of inconsistency in the first place. When you have statement behavior, and all of these, that was it.
Yeah, you're completely right, and that's why the vast majority of focus is on the first two. Is when we come, but I didn't want to exclude behavior, because you can have situations where people, for example, come across incredibly pleasant in interviews. If they're running they're running a company, they're wonderfully polite to people in the interviews, and they go back to the office and they're awful to people, right? So it's not impossible that you can think about these things, but you're right, it's like 80% is in the traditional categories.
I'm being reminded of actors who everybody loves, and then you hear the stories about how they treat their staff or the restaurant waiter really badly, and people react quite strongly to this sort of thing.
Thank you. And then one last question to wrap up. So is there anything that you want to add to what Ruth Bankley posted about the difference between hypocrisy when leveled against individuals versus, say, corporations or institutions?
Yep. I actually found the literature quite hard to read on this because there's a lot of it, and it was very interesting going across different academic disciplines. But I think that it is particularly harshly judged in terms of corporate hypocrisy, and I think also corporations are in a very difficult position because they're often forced to make claims about principles, but also make a profit. And those two things are often in conflict and open you up. Even the most virtuous corporations get accused of being hypocritical in some way. And in fact, the greater claims you make, the more attempts you try to do good, the greater your risk is you'll be accused of hypocrisy. And so I think there are some ways companies can actually present their actions to make it seem less hypocritical in terms of tempering their claims, which is more sustainable. But also I think we need to change our views of what is achievable level of consistency for corporations, given that we give corporations inconsistent demands. We want cheap clothes, but also we want to feel good about ourselves and buying them. Quite often, the source of the inconsistency is our purchasing patterns, and they're trying to respond to those. And yet we want to be able to both be inconsistent in our demands and also criticize companies for responding to those demands. And so I think there's a different conversation you can have there.
Thank you very much, Michael. And on that note, we're out of time, unfortunately, but I think the speakers will be very happy to answer your questions over email. If you can share your, again, emails with us in the chat, that would be wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's NoBeC talk. Thank you, Paul and Michael, for your compelling presentations and contributions. And thank you, everyone, for your participation and questions. We look forward to everyone's participation in next NoBeC talk in October. We actually have 2 scheduled in October. And until then, thank you again. And we look forward to having you join us next time.